Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Happy belated Veterans Day to everyone out there. We actually have two veterans on the podcast today to talk their book, Unwavering. Taylor and Judy were awesome to talk to. This book is great, but it's also very important about how the POW, MIA, POW-MIA, that black flag that you see everywhere, how that came about, all of the people in the Vietnam War that made that happen. It's an amazing book. Amazing to talk to these two, so I'm going to shut up so you can hear from them. Let's do it. And here we are with authors Taylor Baldwin Kiland and Judy Silverstein Gray. Both of you, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so the book is Unwavering, The Lives Who Fought to Ensure No Man is Left Behind, or for anybody who's seen that black flag, POW-MIA. Really incredible story. I just want to ask, Taylor, start with you. How did you and Judy come together? How did the idea of the book come along? How did it all start?
Well, I've written two other books about our nation's prisoners of war from Vietnam. So over the last 20 years, I've gotten to know a lot of them, both professionally and personally, and their families. And about almost 9 years ago now, one of them, his name is Captain Dick Stratton. He's a pretty famous one, actually. Contacted me and said, Taylor, there's been so much written about us, about the Vietnam POWs, so many books, so many documentaries. But there's been less written about the epic home front battle that our wives waged during the war to raise awareness about our plight, to get better treatment for us, and to advocate for our release. And there should be a book written about them, about the wives. And he said, and I think you should write it. And I, smartly saluted and said, yes, sir, Captain. You're right. There should be a book about it. And then I recruited my friend, Judy. She and I collaborated on a couple children's books together to see if she wanted to come along for the ride. And she readily agreed. So that's how we got started.
Judy, is that the story? Is there anything else that she's missing that you want to add to that one?
Only that it was compelling in that this was another little-known story of accidental activists who changed history and persevered and essentially were unwavering. And so it was inspiring. It took a long time for both of us to tease out the most dramatic and cinematic scenes, because these were women who had not discussed their story, who abided by Navy rules to support their husbands and the military, not just Navy rules, but military rules. And these were women who were not accustomed to talking about themselves, but they were getting older, many of them in their late 70s to 90s, and recognized, well, maybe we did something important there. And especially Captain Stratton's wife, whom we started with, was very seminal to the story in that she took it forward as the first female Assistant Deputy Secretary of the Navy for Family Matters.
I think it's really important to point out, we're three vets on the call right now. Judy, you were in the Coast Guard, and Taylor, you were in the Navy. Does it put more pressure on you when you're writing a book like this and you are a veteran, or do you think it actually makes it easier because you have a better understanding of kind of everyone's thought process as you're talking to them?
I think it makes it easier because we understood military requirements. Taylor used the expression saluting smartly. We understand what that means and what the pressures are on family members who also serve, though silently, and what they undergo. Vietnam is still a tough subject for a lot of people. And it's a generation of women who were taught to do more than talk, and they did. And we understood that they understood the rules that the military imposed, either very obviously through guidebooks or inherently and silently. And I think our background in military history comes into play. We looked through dozens of archival documents that are very hard to understand unless you know what the implications are.
I would also point out, Brendan, that while we grew up in a military family and understood the restrictions placed on military families in the last, say, 30 years, what we uncovered was that the restrictions placed on military families and women in particular, military wives, in the early 1960s was incredibly, incredibly oppressive. We forget, especially a younger generation, forget that the early 1960s, when this story begins, culturally was much more like the 1950s. Women did not travel by themselves. Most of the military wives did not work outside the home. If they had a baby, it was perfectly legal to get fired from their jobs because they were having children. They didn't go out to dinner by themselves. They were still wearing white gloves and pearls. That was the expectation. And for military wives, they had to love the military as much as their husbands did. And if they spoke disparagingly about the military, it reflected poorly on their husbands. They had very few communications methods available to them. They had phone books and they had phones, one phone attached to the wall. There were 3 TV stations at that time, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and you could watch cartoons on PBS on Saturday mornings. They didn't have a whole lot of money. They didn't have access to credit. A woman could not get a credit card or a mortgage without a husband's or a father's signature until 1974. No man.
Or even in housing.
Right.
I'm sorry right. Housing. So you had women who were told, as Taylor just outlined beautifully, you have very little access to credit of any kind, even an apartment, but you need to get off this space because your husband has gone missing. They wouldn't have been supported if they spoke up and spoke out. There were very clear rules for protocol and for following the rules, and or there would be consequences for your husband's career. So this is against this backdrop, we started to say, wow, this is really interesting. And they changed not only the rules of engagement, the rules for getting leaving no prisoner behind or no man missing, but they also brought the military unwittingly sometimes into the present so that women weren't bound by as many rules or families as they were when this story began. And Taylor's right. We grew up in a different era, although my mother constantly said to me, make sure you get a credit card in your name. Make sure you put the electricity in your name when you had roommates. And I thought, okay, enough already. But now I realize why. Because it wasn't until after the POWs got home and returned safely that women were allowed to obtain credit in their own name. And it wasn't just credit. It was even birth control. It existed, but most doctors would not write prescriptions for single women. And they would not write them for all women who are married without a man's approval. So this was a very different era. And that's important to keep in mind as you read this book of how they moved from the sidelines to the front lines of activism.
Now, before we jump into the details, because there's a lot of amazing details in the book, from a writing perspective, well, specifically an interview perspective, right? So Taylor, as you were saying, talking to Dick Stratton, then talking to his wife, I know, and I'm open about it too, I have my own battles with PTSD from my service. My father was a Vietnam vet and had his own challenges with that, even though we didn't know what to call it yet. But it's very often family members will end up with it as well, especially with something like missing someone. Is it hard? Because it's one thing when vets get into a bar and start having some beers and everybody starts talking, but you're coming at it from a different direction where you're opening a wound. No matter how nicely you do it, you're opening a wound. So, Taylor, just from your starting, talking with Dick Stratton and then starting to do those interviews, was it very difficult for you? Did you have to do it differently than you might with any other book subject just because this hits so close to home?
Well, I had relationships with a lot of these men and their families already well established because of the 2 decades worth of research that I had amassed for my other 2 books. So I wasn't starting from scratch. I had personal and professional relationships with them. So I believe that helped us. I believe that they were more willing to open up to us. They trusted us. But yes, for some of these families, and I will tell you, especially for the children of these POWs and MIAs, there's a lot of residual damage from that war that these children, grown children now, are still living with. They weren't as active as their parents, and they didn't have that metamorphosis that so many of the women in our book did. You see the transformation of some of these women from these hidebound, shy, conservative, housewives to 2 years later, after pounding their fists and pounding their feet through the halls of Congress and State Department and the Pentagon and the White House and the United Nations and the Paris peace talks. They became very bold. They became very confident. You don't see as much of that amongst the kids, even the grown kids. But with time and with multiple interviews and multiple attempts at getting them to trust us, we eventually got most of them to talk to us.
Judy, anything to add on that one?
Yeah. So my background in journalism taught me to ask the tough questions, but you can't just put a woman in her 80s on Zoom, which was a little bit of a journey for some of them. And then when we had two authors, someone may be uncomfortable with technology and they can't see us yet. You can't just launch into, so what did it feel like every morning when you woke up and wondered? Can you describe the agony? So you start with questions that we thought would be easy. What kind of a phone did you have? And they're like, I think it was rotary. Was it on the wall or was it on the counter? And you had to go back in time. So they couldn't remember the answer to that question, one woman in particular. So we talked about when she was talking to her casualty officer and she got the news. It was dinner time. What was she doing with the kids? And we had to prompt a little bit. Would you have been pushing them into a child seat of any sort or a high chair? And when they talked about things that were so familiar and routine, they would open up. And so slowly we would tease out these stories. And I say slowly because we had to pore over our own transcripts like mad to find that nugget, that kernel that would make the story relatable for many people, not just women, but because this is not a wives' tale, but for men as well. And so then we had to double check with the phone company to find out what colors of the phones were available. And all these details, we were really meticulous, and we were happy that the readers have started noticing this, because one of the questions we got recently from someone who attended a talk in Massachusetts was, how did you get all those details? Because it's got enough details that I felt like I was living the story. Well, that's what we wanted. From the beginning, Brendan, I could hear this and see it as a docudrama or a film or a television series. And so we thought about that in cinematic terms. And that guided us. So we had the women recruited to almost help us on that journey to fill in the blanks. And they, up until really right before we turned in the manuscript, they were uncovering photos and documents. But we had to triangulate with existing documents as well. So it was very tough. And there were times, I believe in the beginning, I really wanted to dance around the questions and get to the issue of the missing man and the fear and the pain a little bit later to give them the tincture of time to heal, because they were still healing when we started this. We had ripped the Band-Aid off a story that mostly had remained tucked away. So that part was tough. Taylor had that established relationship, and I was lucky enough to enjoy the fruits of that relationship. But now we were talking about something that was terribly personal. And I want you to know there were a few women who said, I can't do this interview with you. I don't want to be in the book because I don't want to relive it. And I also wanted to bring up something else. Taylor touched on this. The families do bear the scars, and they're very real. And we've been traveling with some of them and speaking with some of them, and it is palpable, especially to us. But think about the children. Their fathers are missing, and they've said this to us. And then their moms are advocating, so they're essentially not present in a sense. It's kind of a loss on two fronts, although they're really proud of their moms and very surprised in some cases at the detail of their involvement, and very proud of it. So it was tough.
You just mentioned something, Judy, that kind of popped in my head, the casualty notification officer. And it just made me think, especially for listeners who, are not steeped in, military families and things like that. I remember being trained to be a casualty notification officer, and thank God it was never called. But this part of just the military it's just more touchy than everything else. I remember thinking, if I had the choice of, hey, go back into some sort of firefight or be the casualty notification officer, 10 out of 10 times I'd go to the firefight. Please just put me out there. I know what to do. Where this was just the most dreaded aspect of anything in the military. I think that just nobody wants to touch this at all. And, jumping into the actual aspect of it, I have to say, I'm going to admit on here right now, the black flag is ubiquitous. Everybody in the military knows what it is. Until I picked up your book, I didn't know the history behind it because it was just sacrosanct. It was like, no man left behind. Got it. Were either of you really shocked by how it all came to be? Or did you have, Judy, did you already have kind of an idea of where it came from? Or was this all new history to you like it was to me?
It was pretty new to me. I mean, I wore a POW bracelet from the time I was 12 till I was 18. Not every day, but a camp counselor sold them to us. And I said, what's this for? And she said, you have to wear yours until that man comes home. And that sort of was my involvement in the war as a 12-year-old. And they were, I remember them being about $2. We uncovered they were about $2.50, the price of a movie ticket. So that icon stuck with me. And the flag, once Taylor said to me, it's ubiquitous, exactly the word you used, Brendan. You can't drive 5 miles in this country, she likes to say, without seeing one. Every federal building, every post office, the White House, the Capitol. You assume that this is true and it's always been true. And then you realize these women changed the way we treat our missing. And that is when I got the chills on the back of my spine and said, this is a story.
You have to remember, Brendan, before the Vietnam War, we just left our missing. We have 72,000 missing from World War II, more than 7,200 missing from Korea. And we had something called the U.S. Graves Registration. And after the cessation of hostilities, the United States would make a concerted effort over the course of, 12 months or so to retrieve as many bodies as possible or bury them at the site, right? We have lots of cemeteries all over the world. But most of the missing in action were unilaterally declared dead within a year. And they washed their hands of it. That changed after the Vietnam War because of the advocacy of these families during the Vietnam War.
And I mean, with being steeped in history, right, like, I knew that conceptually and everything, but I think especially for even people who are right around my generation and younger, they would remember the story of Jessica Lynch, where time stopped right until she was rescued. And as you're saying, Taylor, World War II, it was just like, there's too many, there's this and there's that. And Vietnam is that big sea change where all of a sudden it's everyone has to come home one way or the other.
Right.
And right now, you can open a newspaper pretty much every month and see that remains were returned to families that are 60, 80 years old. We're tireless because these women insisted on the development of an agency now called the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency that has a massive budget, 130 million, I believe, and multiple hundreds of employees that scour the world looking for our missing. And that, while it may not bring what we think of as closure to families, comforts them in a way because somebody still cares. And that's what's changed. That may not seem important to someone who hasn't served in the military, but it is the humanitarian side, the personal issue of war.
This book is not really about war. It's about the human impact of war, the family impact of war, and how a small group of military wives insisted that the fate of their missing and captive husbands, brothers, sons, fathers, they made them a national priority, a priority that exists today. And prior to their work and their advocacy, the fate of those missing men from previous wars just was not a national priority.
I would argue that it had to be women to do this, to find a humanitarian aspect of the war that could galvanize the nation around an issue to account for the missing, because they were selfless. They didn't just say, gee, I now have heard from a wingman, he probably didn't have a good parachute, and my husband may be missing. They advocated for all the missing and all the POWs. And that's what's so instructive, where you find an issue that's bigger than yourself and you stay with it and you're unwavering until it's resolved.
Well, I mean, hell hath no fury like a military spouse who's decided they're going to do something, right?
Exactly.
It's a requirement that you have your administrative stuff completely put together and you will just not let anything stand in your way.
Right. But that hasn't always been the case. I mean, families were not a priority in the military. My mom used to complain, that she was told if the Navy wanted you to have a family, they would have issued it to you in your sea bag. So, it wasn't part of the uniform distribution that sailors get when they join the Navy. So the message to her was, you're not a priority. Your housing's not a priority. Your medical care is not a priority. Your needs, your emotions, your children's needs, not a priority. That has also really changed since Vietnam. I'm sure there's many military spouses today who would say that it's far from perfect, but I can assure you it is much better for military families than it was during the Vietnam War.
And Judy, one of the things, especially doing this podcast, very often I jump into more specific stories, but you both have jammed so much in here. Like there's just dozens and dozens of women like trying to figure this stuff out. But it's also very interesting because they all weren't pulling in the same direction necessarily throughout either. How did you even decide who was going to be in the book? Because, I mean, again, we can't just go one by one. This will be 8 hours long. It will be a great 8 hours, but, podcasts can only be so long.
We had lots of discussions about who to include, and we both have these enormous dry erase boards where we gave monikers to certain women. So we knew that as characters, although they were real life historical people who underwent everything we were talking about, they had, one was a champion, one was an advocate, but we wanted to differentiate them so that this story was larger than Vietnam, which, is sprawling in and of itself, but it was a human story. So, for example, we have a Black enlisted POW wife named Andrea Rander. And Andrea Rander told us a story kind of offhand about being in Greensboro the year before she went to visit her then boyfriend in North Georgia. So imagine being a Black woman walking in with another Black woman, and you're unmarried, by the way, divorced, into a Woolworths and sitting at a counter with a sign that says whites only. It gave us cultural context. Her story was so real because she didn't just say, I fought the good fight. She said, I was terrified. I could feel their eyes boring into me. So immediately you're thinking cinematic. This is not only cinematic, this is real life. And it's true. She grew up, by contrast, in a neighborhood in New York City, same neighborhood General Colin Powell grew up in, and had never experienced racism until she was a little older and had to switch trains at Union Station, Washington, D.C. in the 60s and the late 50s to the back and ride in the back. And suddenly you went, oh my goodness, anyone who lived through or is interested in the 60s will be interested in this story. Then we had a woman who is one of the first of 1,500 to become a nurse practitioner, Mrs. Pat Mearns, an MIA wife. And it goes on from there. Alice Stratton was a social worker. Some of them were stewardesses, not just one. And so they were used to a life of service to customers. And what skills did they use and what made them stand out? And we went from amorphous figures who were just obedient wives to really strong characters that could be compelling. And more than a few people say, oh my gosh, I feel like I lived through this. And your book, somebody said this to me yesterday, your book made me recall all the songs of that era. And to that point, Brendan, we often had collectively and separately videos from the 1960s that were being released. Dan Rather interviewing Richard Nixon was released while we were writing this. We played songs from that era. Originally, we had songs at the beginning or excerpts of songs at the beginning of each chapter to put you in that frame of mind where rights were different for all kinds of groups, where women weren't as vocal and expected not to be, and their narratives became really compelling. And then we said, we need a family that didn't persevere. We need a family that really buckled under the pressure. And we began to find that everybody suffered in their own ways, some more overtly than others.
Taylor, I'm going to put you on the spot, but Judy, be ready because you're going to get the same question. So I was thinking this is so easy to be a miniseries, right? But I'm a producer. I come to you, Taylor, say we're going to make this movie, miniseries, whatever it is. But I need you to tell me which character is the actual star. Which one are we going to, right? They all deserve it. But one of them has to be the main character that we're going to follow their story all the way through. Who is it for you?
If I had to pick one of the women in the book to be the star, I think one of the most interesting characters that would make a really good star is Valerie Kushner. Valerie Kushner was the wife of an Army doctor, Dr. Hal Kushner, who was shot down and held in the South. If you know anything about the conditions in the South, it was not the Hanoi Hilton. It was not an existing prison. They lived in makeshift jungle camps. And he didn't have any medicine or antibiotics or surgical equipment. And he had 12 men die in his arms while he was in captivity. His wife was like many of the other military wives. She was very smart, but she was towing, the Army line, and she was a housewife. And she tried to get medical supplies. She flew to Cambodia to try and deliver medical supplies. Now, of course, she didn't go by herself. This was at a time when women did not travel by themselves. She had a male chaperone from the American Medical Association who went with her and carried the supplies of medicine. She was turned away, and she was told by the official that her husband was not going to come home until this war is over. And a metamorphosis began with her, where she decided that she was no longer going to be this compliant Army wife, and she was also no longer going to be a Nixonette. She decided that this war was not going to end until her husband was not going to come home until this war ended. And so when Nixon ran for re-election in 1972 with the same slogan, "I'm going to end this war," she said to herself, he didn't end it. He said in 1968 he was going to end this war. 4 years later, he says he's going to end it again. I don't believe him. And she went out and became a firebrand political activist for McGovern. She ended up creating a splinter group. The National League of Families is the group that the wives organized and created in 1970. She created a splinter group that was more overtly political and was more anti-war and was pro-McGovern. And she provided the seconding speech for McGovern at the DNC convention in Miami in July of 1972. If you see videos of her from 69 and then you see videos of her in 72, the transformation is unbelievable. She found her voice. Not everyone agreed with her, but I think she had strong convictions, and she was a firebrand, and she would make a very compelling star for this series.
Judy, your turn.
Gosh, I have to say, because we used those two clips in some of our talks, I'd have to say that sums it up.
Now, I'm going to segue without editorializing, but I have very strong feelings about the next subject I want to bring up. Taylor, how did you feel about some of the anti-war protest leadership? Because you highlight just a few instances where, and listen, protesting the war was one thing. We're not talking about that. I felt very enraged and uncomfortable with how some of the anti-war protest leadership would have connections with the North Vietnamese that I think even nowadays people would say that's messed up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, in a nutshell, they were traitors. They absolutely were traitors. They collaborated. We're talking about Cora Weiss, Madeline Duckles, Dellinger. They collaborated with Hanoi and advised them as to how to maximize the propaganda value for the North Vietnamese. That's very different from going into the streets and protesting the war. They were traitors.
Well, and they actively would hold back information about these missing men from their families, right?
Yeah, I mean, they publicly claimed that they were the official conduit. And Cora Weiss, I found an oral history of hers where she said this was her idea, where she created an organization and convinced the North Vietnamese that her organization would be the official communications conduit between Hanoi and the families. And the U.S. government really couldn't do anything about it. So all the mail to and from the families in Hanoi had to go through her organization. And she personally delivered them to Hanoi and then personally brought mail back. And she claimed that when they released lists of names of missing, that they were official and they were complete. And she never doubted the North Vietnamese. She said, they wouldn't lie to me. They wouldn't lie to us.
Judy, is there anybody that you wanted to punch as you were doing your research?
Punch. Obviously Cora Weiss comes to mind. The men were being tortured. They were held in isolation. They had psychological torture they had to endure, and as well as physical. And none of the tenets of the Geneva Convention were followed, that they would get basic medical care, that they could exchange letters and packages with their families. So yes, you could put yourself in that role, whether you served in the military or not. The North Vietnamese were signatories to this. Why couldn't we get this to happen? And the North Vietnamese taunted the women with this. They very much knew who they were when they first came to Paris, as we tell in the first chapter. But they say, we'll get back to you. And then to have to go through people who we found in a file withheld a letter with Cora Weiss, had a letter that was never mailed to one of the families. Some of the women say they saw files that the Coley fam kept on them. So the White House was keeping dossiers on the women and on the peace activists, and the peace activists were keeping dossiers on the families. And it's a little shocking that we would resort to this and not pull together. But also, Nixon received more than 2,000 telegrams from the families and the women on the eve of his inauguration. I would love to ask him, why did you not meet with them? You could have had peace with honor so much sooner if you had made them your allies. And it took him a long time to meet with them. There were other government officials who I'd like to question. Why were they so tone deaf to the needs of the families? And is it context? Is it what was important? Or do they really not know who was organizing the war? But we really neglected POWs and MIAs. And most importantly, families that were languishing, wondering what was going on, and were very supportive and showed allegiance to their government. And then there were some reporters I'd like to ask questions about from.
Judy, you actually just kind of segued right into my next question. If you could have access to somebody that you did not have access to, either they passed or they wouldn't talk to you, is there somebody at the front of your mind that as you're reading, you're like, I really wish I could talk to this person? And if it is Richard Nixon, I will posit that he has to tell you the truth as well.
As I said, I would like to question why the women could not get even to Kissinger without a fight. And then why, when Kissinger met with them, were there so many delays? He seemed to understand their value eventually, but it took such a long time. Obviously, I do not understand to this day why people had access to a known traitor government, a communist government that we were not supposed to travel to. Tom Hayden was there in the early 60s, and I cannot figure out why, long before the peace movement. I'd like to unravel that. I really would. And even Dan Rather's interview with Nixon, which I remembered as being hostile. His first interview was not hostile at all. They actually got along very well. And he asks Nixon on behalf of his wife, could you ever see a woman in the White House? And Nixon is very candid and said, well, yes, I really, really could. Why then did these women not get traction? And that's one of my questions.
Taylor, who would be on that list for you, somebody you could talk to that you didn't get to?
Definitely Richard Nixon. I would have loved to have a very candid conversation with him, 20 years later after the war, about what he really thought about the women. Some of the private conversations that the White House taped made it clear that once these women got traction with the media and on Capitol Hill, that they were intimidated. And he and Kissinger used words like, we need to keep them on the reservation. We need to keep them in line.
Well, jumping from a president to a presidential hopeful, Ross Perot, he comes out of nowhere in this thing. Taylor, did you know that Ross Perot was so huge in this story when you started it?
Yes, I did.
And was that something that just, maybe I missed it. I don't know how I missed it, but he's running around, he's gathering money and ruffling a few feathers along the way, right?
Yes. And you can make a strong argument. I think we make a strong argument in the book that he was doing this for the Nixon campaign and for the Nixon administration. But that does not diminish his personal feelings about these families and their plight. It was a very, very real passion for him to help these women and to help these families. But he also knew that it was benefiting the Nixon administration.
He seemed like a very sincere guy, but also, and I can't think of a better term, just a little bit weird, a little bit off, right? Where it just kind of comes out of nowhere, like I said, right?
Yeah, early on, Taylor shared what she knew about Ross Perot, and I was touched that he had heard the story of a POW wife and was very moved by it. And that was a different side of Ross Perot than I had heard about or seen or read about. And I knew he was a brilliant businessman, but when he gets on an issue, it seemed as if he never lets go, which sort of mirrored the women's persistence. So they did it in a much more genteel, not in your face kind of way. The tragedy is he's one of those sort of semi-politicians who doesn't know when to exit stage right and may have fueled some of the opposite by making this his cause célèbre. You know, flying around the world, the average person can't do that. But what did it really accomplish? I think it gave the women a lot of support that they probably needed at that time.
Well, unlike Ross, I do know when to exit stage right. So one more question for the both of you. Taylor, I'll start with you. There are these people out there, and they're very, very misinformed. They think that reading history is not fun, and it's not important necessarily. It was a class you had to take in high school. You never have to worry about it again. If I got one of those poor misguided souls and sat them down in front of you and they said, why should I read Unwavering? Taylor, what would you say?
Well, I'm going to assume one of these people that you're referring to is a woman, because both Judy and I have lots of women friends who have said to us, well, I don't read books about military history. I don't like books about war. And my response to them is, this is not a book about war. This is about the family impact, the human impact of war at home. This is about a home front battle, about a group of untrained accidental activists who, because they were fighting for the men they loved, changed history.
Judy, how about you? What would you say to them?
Well, I'd add to that we wrote it in a way that it reads like a novel. We wrote it non-chronologically, which is really hard and challenging. And we wrote it in a way that everyone has a tidbit they can understand and relate to that makes a little bit more sense of the 60s, but more importantly is the quintessential American story of how a gutsy group elevated an issue of great importance to them to importance for the entire nation. And it's something we all remember, whether you remember the POW bracelets, whether you learn about the flag, whether the music of resistance and support for the war, whether it's tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree or it's we ain't marching anymore. There's something for everyone because the 60s were confusing and complex. And it's important to understand that at the most vulnerable, you can still make a difference. The fight might go on for decades. The head of the National League of Families is still at it. And just recently in 2019 buried her own brother because a fisherman snagged his net on the canopy of a plane and they were able to identify after 20 dives a piece of a rib bone that brought some comfort to her family. She's still at it because she knows there are still people missing and that Americans deserve to know what happened to them and American families need some comfort. But you can make a difference. And this is an important story for both men and women.
Well, Judy Taylor, the book is fantastic and it is important. Thank you both for writing it and thank you both for coming on.
Thank you very much for having us, Brendan.
Thank you, Brendan. It was a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Taylor and Judy, thank you so much for coming on. Unwavering, great book, everybody. Super important. Go out there and grab it. You'll enjoy it. Hit us up, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Send us emails. Leave us 5-star reviews, please. Anything, just anything, just saying that we're great. We really appreciate it. It helps us a lot and doesn't take too much time. You can do it. We'd love you for it. Until next time, stay cool, nerds.